Hidden in the remote hills of Ellensburg, Washington, lies a secret so bizarre and unexplainable, it's baffled experts, intrigued investigators, and even spurred government interest. Imagine a hole so deep, so mysterious, that it swallows everything thrown into it without ever filling up. A hole that seems to defy the very laws of physics and nature. But this is no urban legend. This is Mel's Hole. Join us as we dive into this mystery, unraveling tales of government cover-ups, paranormal phenomena, and inexplicable events that will leave you questioning the boundaries of our reality. The world's a strange place. Let's talk about it. It all began on February 21st, 1997, when a man named Mel Waters called into the popular late-night radio show Coast to Coast AM, hosted by Art Bell. Mel had a story so incredible that it instantly captured the imagination of listeners around the world. Mel described a mysterious hole in his property that seemed to defy the laws of physics. For years, Mel and his neighbors had been using the hole as a dump site. But no matter how much they threw into it, the hole never filled up. Mel would go on to appear on Coast to Coast 2 more times to relate even more of the story as events unfolded.
The people from around there throw all the stuff in the hole. I mean, it's just been going on for a long time. Well, I got this thinking one day, how come this hole is not filling up?
Mel had owned and lived on his property in Ellensburg, Washington, near the Monastash Ridge, for about 4 years before he called into Art's show with his story. He tells of a mysterious hole, about 9 feet across, surrounded by a 3 to 4 foot barrier wall, and lined with stone for about the first 15 feet below the surface. This hole had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and locals had been using it as a sort of a dumping ground for many years, throwing everything from garbage to household appliances and even dead cattle into it. In all those years, it never showed signs of filling up, which aroused his curiosity. Mel set out to understand more about the nature of this mysterious hole. At first, he thought it was an old mine shaft. What he knew for sure was that it was deep. So deep that it was not possible to see the bottom, even with the strongest flashlights Mel could put his hands on. Items thrown into the hole made no sound, and in fact, he said that the hole seemed to have unusual properties that absorbed all sound within it. Echoes were swallowed up when he tried shouting into it. Having been a pretty serious shark fisherman, Mel had a significant amount of high-tensile fishing line on hand, so he devised an experiment to plumb the depths of the hole and try to figure out exactly how far it descended below the surface. He made a frame across the hole so the line wouldn't snag on the edges, tied a 1-pound weight to the end of the line, and lowered it in. He reeled out the first 1,500 yards of the line, 4,500 feet worth, but still couldn't find the bottom. He wondered if there was perhaps water at the bottom, so he pulled the line back up and tied a roll of lifesavers to it, reasoning that the candy would melt if left in the water and would at least give him an indication of what might be down there. However, when he returned later and pulled the line back up, the roll of candy was dry. More curious than ever, Mel attached another spool of line to the first, this one a 5,000-yard spool, certainly more than enough for even the deepest of holes, he figured. But by the time he'd fed out the entirety of this spool, he still hadn't reached bottom. So he attached another spool and continued paying the line out into the hole. Still nothing. So he attached another, and then even more. And by the time he finally ran out of spools of line, he had lowered 80,000 feet of line into the hole. That's more than 15 miles, or 24 kilometers of line.
And basically at the point where I had reached 80,000 feet of line into the hole.
This just didn't seem possible. The deepest artificial hole ever dug by man, even today, is the Kola Super Deep borehole in Russia. And that's just over 40,000 feet or 12 kilometers, half the depth that Mel Waters measured. What was going on here? To add to this was the unexplainable stories and experiences surrounding the hole itself. Animals would avoid the hole entirely. Mel's own dogs wouldn't come anywhere near the hole, and in fact stayed beside his Suburban whenever he took them out there with him. When he tried to pull them by their leashes nearer the hole, they would dig in their feet to the dirt and resist with all their strength. One of Mel's neighbors told him that when his dog died, he had thrown it into the hole. I'm not sure why anyone would do such a thing, but that's not the point. A few days later, while out in the woods, his neighbor spotted that dog, alive and well and running through the trees. To say he was surprised is putting it mildly, but something wasn't right about the dog. It ignored his calls completely and avoided him. In fact, it was as if the dog didn't recognize him at all. But Mel's neighbor was absolutely positive that this was his dog. It even had the same collar and tag he buried it with. Mel even reported a beam of what he called black light that would burst from the hole periodically and was seen by numerous people in the area.
And so, it was the next day or whatever, I go back there and, I'm driving up to my property, and even before I get anywhere near the property, I'm met by basically uniformed people who are telling me that there was a plane crash.
After the first radio appearance, Mel was concerned that he may have given away too many clues about the location of the hole. He feared that he would return to his property only to find it overrun with curious explorers or perhaps the unwanted attention of some clandestine government agency. Mel and his wife had been staying in Ellensburg since a recent snowstorm had caused the collapse of several buildings on his property. But after the show aired, he decides he needs to take a drive out there just to make sure everything is okay. When Mel returns to the access road to his property, however, he is stopped at the entrance by armed men in military uniforms, refusing to allow him in. They tell him that there's been a plane crash on his property, and nobody is permitted to enter until the investigation is completed. But he hasn't heard anything about a plane crash, and there's no smoke or fire or any other evidence that such a thing has happened. When he argues with the guards and demands to speak with someone in charge, he's approached by a man dressed in civilian clothing, who tells him he needs to leave. Mel tries to argue with the unidentified man, but the man tells him that he's no longer the owner of this property, and if he doesn't leave immediately, it wouldn't be too hard for them to find a drug lab on his property. The veiled threat isn't lost on Mel, and he quickly realizes that he's in no position to keep arguing, so he leaves, trying to figure out what to do next. Later, before he's even had the opportunity to really absorb all that's happened, he's contacted with an offer to lease his property to the government for a sizable sum of money. Along with this, he also agrees to leave the U.S. and keep his mouth shut about the hole. It's clear that someone wants him out of the way. Not seeing an alternative, Mel accepts the offer and is relocated to Australia. It's there he remains for more than 2 years, collecting payments totaling more than $6 million from the U.S. government. Finally, though, more than a little homesick and missing his family, he decides to return to the U.S. in December of '99. And this is where the story begins to really take a turn. When Mel returns, he doesn't attempt to visit his property, but instead reaches out to Art Bell once more to share updates about where he's been for the last 2 years. They speak and arrange a time for him to appear on Coast to Coast. The day before he's scheduled to appear on the show, he's helping his nephew move from Tacoma to Olympia. Having returned the moving truck afterwards, Mel is returning to Olympia via bus when an altercation between 2 passengers suddenly breaks out. The bus pulls over and a number of police and transit vehicles arrive, removing everyone from the bus and taking statements. When they approach Mel and ask him to come with them to give his statement, he tells them he doesn't have time. He has to get back to Olympia and can't risk missing the last bus home. The whole situation is strange, and Mel has a bad feeling about it. The police assure him that he can stay and talk to them, and they'll give him a ride back to Olympia afterwards. Reluctantly, he agrees. He accompanies the officers, and this is the last thing he remembers. 12 days later, Mel wakes up in an alley in a seedy part of San Francisco, with no memories of what's happened. What he does know is that he's missing his wallet and personal items and is sore and battered. He's clearly been beaten. He's missing teeth in the back of his mouth and has needle and tape marks on his arms indicative of an IV.
I could still see the tape on my arms where they had taped down an IV or some sort of thing to it.
Confused, disoriented, not understanding what's happened to him during those missing 12 days, he returns to his nephew in Olympia. When he arrives, he discovers that he's now been served with legal documents. He's accused of making illegal modifications to his property in Ellensburg, a place he hasn't even stepped foot on in more than 2 years. Paving, power lines, installation of septic facilities, and other heavy construction projects are all alleged to have occurred on his property without the proper permits or authorizations. Mel is told that his land has now been forfeited, and he no longer has any claim on it. When he checks his bank account, he discovers that all his money is gone. He has nothing.
Brother, talk about going from being a whole baron to absolutely...
Yeah, I had nothing. That's kind of where I left everything.
It's not a stretch to connect the dots and see that Mel appears to be paying the price for returning to the U.S. and daring to open his mouth again about the hole. Someone wants to send the message that they can do anything they want to him at any time, and he's powerless to stop them. He learns that the property, which he now no longer has claim to, is surrounded by a chain-link fence and access to it is restricted. Satellite images of the area show an entire section of the map covering his land obscured by a large white square. Additionally, the no-fly zone over the nearby Yakima firing range has now been expanded to include the property where the hole exists. Whatever's there, it seems like somebody is going to great lengths to make sure it's well hidden.
Find the hole, but they did find near the area where you were talking about a lot of military boot prints and all kinds of information that would indicate the military, in fact, had been there or was there.
Oh, they would have probably seen a lot of yellow gear tread marks in the ground.
Yep.
Art Bell notes that a television news crew went up to Ellensburg following the broadcast to investigate Mel's story. Although they didn't find the hole, they did find military boot prints in the tracks of heavy gear in the area that Mel had described. Evidence that the military was there, or at least had recently been there. Mel Waters, having been stripped of his land and money, is surprised to be contacted by a Native American tribe from Nevada. It seems that word of his story from Art Bell's show has reached them, and they have something they want him to see. Mel travels to Nevada, where he meets up with the Native Americans who contacted him. There, he's introduced to the Basques, a people traditionally indigenous to a region of Europe that straddles France and Spain. In the 1800s, a large community of Basque immigrants settled in the southwest of the United States, including Nevada. And they have a hole of their own. When Mel arrives, they spend some time with him, vetting him, trying to make sure he's not connected to the media or government. Once satisfied, they bring him to a remote, uninhabited area in the Nevada wilderness. There, he finds another hole in the ground, strikingly similar to the one on his property in Washington. This new hole is about 9 feet across, the same size as the other hole, but instead of being surrounded by a stone wall, this one has a metal ring around the top. Mel describes it as being about 2 feet high and just as thick, and looking very much like some sort of locking collar, as if it were made to be connected to some unknown piece of machinery. As far down as he can see into it, the walls of the pit are lined with the same strange metal. The Basques tell him that the hole has been there, looking exactly like it is now, since before they arrived in the area, nearly 2 centuries earlier. Mel tells Art that the metal collar surrounding the hole was warm to the touch, and the air around it also stayed warm even in the dead of winter. The Basques tell him that when their people camped near the hole, it would keep their tents warm no matter how cold it was outside. What's more, Mel relates that he once accidentally dropped a wrench onto the metal collar, and when it hit, it made absolutely no sound at all. The Native Americans didn't want anything to do with the hole, but the Basques considered it something of spiritual significance. They told him of a black beam of light that would emit from it occasionally, the same as what had been reported with the hole in Washington. Mel convinced the Basques to perform some experiments with this hole, seeing his chance to continue his quest to understand its purpose and nature. First, they put some ice in 2 buckets, one of which they kept on the surface as a sort of control, and the other they lowered 1,500 feet into the hole. They waited until the ice on the surface had melted about halfway, then began pulling up the line. When the bucket finally reached the surface, they were surprised to find that the ice hadn't melted at all, despite the fact that this hole seemed to constantly radiate heat. When Mel reached out and picked up pieces of the ice, he found that the ice was no longer cold, and it didn't melt in his hands. He described it as feeling almost like crystals of some sort. Something had fundamentally altered the ice down in that hole. Something had changed it into a completely different type of substance.
And the ice in the bucket did not melt.
It didn't melt.
It was not melted.
Trying to understand what was going on, they placed the bucket on the campfire to try to melt the ice, and immediately the ice caught fire, burning with an almost invisible flame and glowing faintly. These crystals would continue to burn non-stop for at least the next year, and maybe even longer. One of the Basques took some of the ice home and placed it in his wood-burning stove, where it continued to burn and keep his entire cabin warm throughout the winter. The next experiment was a little more extreme, and afterwards, Mel would regret not trying to talk the Basques out of it. I should warn you, this part of the story gets a little dark. One of the younger men volunteers to be lowered into the hole, which leads to a heated debate among the group. Mel argues this is a bad idea. They have no idea what's down there, or even if there's enough oxygen to support the man. This debate goes on for a bit before a compromise is finally reached. Now, it's important to understand that the Basques are sheep herders, and have been for many generations. To them and their way of life, sheep are just livestock, resources to be used as they see fit. It seems an obvious solution to their dilemma to send one down the hole as part of the investigation. So that's exactly what they do. Rigging a frame and strong cable over the hole, they coax a sheep into a crate. The sheep, according to Mel, is completely going crazy at this point. It's terrified and struggling and making all sorts of terrible panicked noises as they raise it over the hole and prepare to lower it in. However, once they begin lowering it into the hole, all noise from the animal stops. They can still see and feel the vibrations of the animal as it struggles in the crate, but everything is completely silent now. They begin lowering the cable. At about half the line, or 700 feet, the shuddering from the cable stops abruptly, and all is still. When they reach the 1,500-foot mark, at the end of their cable, they feel a sudden, strong tremor in the line, and a sort of static electricity can be felt all around the hole. 30 minutes later, they begin to pull the crate back up out of the hole. When it finally reaches the surface, everything looks normal on the outside of the crate, but there's no movement from the sheep within. Opening the crate to investigate, they find the animal dead. There are no obvious signs of injury, and the sheep looks completely unscathed. However, when the Basques decide to cut the sheep open, what they find is something completely unexpected. The sheep looks like it's been cooked from the inside out. What's more, all of the internal organs are missing completely, and the cavity of the carcass is now filled with a sort of gel. But it's not the gel that's demanding their attention now. It's the pulsing, moving object within the gel. Mel describes it as some alien object that looks like a 2-foot-long tumor, now occupying the insides of the sheep. The Basques have never seen anything like this before, Nobody has. They decide to cut into the tumor to see what's inside. Yeah, I know, maybe not the best idea. At first, they have some difficulty even piercing the outside of it. But when they finally manage to cut through, what they find inside is inexplicable. It's not a tumor. It's something else, something alive.
And inside this tumor is what it appeared to be a fetal seal.
The best way Mel can describe it is that it resembles a fetal seal, but with what looks like human eyes. The men are all positive that it's certainly not a sheep and isn't anything that belongs in there. Mel tells us that this creature begins to turn its attention on the men and goes on for a time to regard them with what he believes is a clear intelligence. He describes it as an almost religious experience, something completely otherworldly. For the next 2 hours, in fact, this creature seems to silently study each of the men in turn. The men, for their part, are keeping their distance, understandably shaken and uncertain what to do next. Finally, Mel feels an overwhelming urge to go to the creature and pick it up, placing it on the edge of the metal collar around the hole. He feels as if the creature is somehow communicating its desires to him, compelling him to help it. With a final look at the men, the seal creature turns and disappears into the hole without a sound. Mel goes on to tell Art Bell about this experience and about something not previously disclosed, that he had been diagnosed with an advanced and terminal cancer. In the weeks that follow, however, Mel begins to realize that he is feeling a lot better. In fact, he feels so much better that he goes back to his doctor in Washington for another check. When he does, he's told that the doctors can no longer find any trace of the aggressive cancer he's been battling. They can't explain what's happened, but he's now cancer-free. To Mel, however, there's only one possible explanation: the Nevada hole and this mysterious creature. When he later returns to Nevada, Mel meets with a Basque elder, and the two of them spend a long time talking together. Mel tells him all about his experiences, both in Washington as well as Nevada. But the man doesn't appear surprised. In fact, he accepts everything Mel tells him as if he's expected every word of it. As they part ways later that evening, the Basque elder places something small in Mel's hand, telling him to keep it safe. After he leaves, Mel looks at what the man has given him and finds that it's a dime. Confused, he inspects it closer and is surprised at what he finds. Mel is holding a 1943 Roosevelt dime with a B mint mark. This is significant for two reasons. Firstly, there is no U.S. mint that uses a B marking. In the 20th century, there were only 3 locations that minted dimes: Denver, Philadelphia, and San Francisco, D, P, and S respectively. Secondly, and perhaps more confusing, is the date. Franklin Roosevelt was still alive in 1943. Roosevelt dimes weren't minted until 1946, a year after his death. Mel has no explanation for this. He's told that the Basque elder found the dime buried in the earth near the hole, along with other inexplicable artifacts. Is this an indication that perhaps this hole is really a portal or gateway to an alternate dimension? Perhaps a dimension where the Nazis won World War II. Maybe the B mint mark refers to Berlin, as is hypothesized by Mel in his conversation with Art Bell. It's a stretch, sure, but there aren't too many people counterfeiting dimes, so we're already wading off into uncharted territory. Art Bell asks Mel to take a picture of the dime and send it to him, which Mel promises to do. Mel also tells him that he's heading back to Nevada to continue his research on the new hole. Art asks him to collect any evidence while he's there, to which Mel agrees. It's at this point that Mel Waters goes dark again. Rumors begin to circulate that he's died, perhaps finally becoming too much of a liability for those secret organizations that wish to keep the holes and their apparent powers to themselves. Time goes by with no trace of Mel. Nobody's heard from him, and Art has been unable to reach him. And then one day, out of the blue, Mel Waters reaches out to Art Bell again and agrees to come on the show and provide an update to the listeners. He doesn't provide information on his current location and makes a cryptic reference to the fact that he's had a very close brush with death since their previous conversation, though he doesn't elaborate any further on it. Mel has spent more time in Nevada with the Basques, studying the hole. He tells him that there have been a lot of military helicopters flying over and around the Nevada site since the last time he spoke to Art. It's unclear what they want or what they're doing, but he seems certain it's related to the hole. It's at that point Mel provides a surprising update. Remember the ice? Remember that one of the men took some of the ice home with him to use in his wood-burning stove, and how it burned through the winter and kept his cabin warm. Well, the man shared with Mel a shocking story. Shortly after bringing the ice substance home, he said that the air in his cabin grew terribly dry, to the point that even the steam from boiling water seemed to be attracted to and absorbed by the stove itself. The man complained that he was now always thirsty, no matter how much he drank, and started experiencing skin problems, to the point where his skin began flaking off. One day, the man returns home, only to find that the wood stove has somehow crashed through the hearth and the floorboards of his cabin, and is now sitting on the ground underneath. Not knowing what else to do, the man patches up the stovepipe to the stove's new position and continues on. A couple of weeks later, though, the man comes back to his cabin to discover that the entire structure and everything inside has now collapsed around the stove, disintegrating to nothing more than what looks like old sawdust. The stove has now sunk even deeper into the ground, nearly 5 feet, and it's still burning. For all the world, it looks like the stove is creating a square shaft in the earth, almost as if it's in the process of forming a brand new hole. The walls of this new pit are exceptionally smooth, like the ground has been melted into some sort of glassy material. Having no other options, the man is forced to abandon the remains of his cabin and moves in with his brothers. He still comes out to watch the stove as it continues to bore deeper into the earth. And then, not too much after, a team that looks to be comprised of military and scientific researchers shows up at the site of the man's cabin with heavy equipment. It looks like they're trying to remove the stove, but all their attempts are failing, so they keep bringing in heavier and larger equipment. Finally, with the help of 2 huge cranes, they're able to lift the stove from the ground and place it on what the man calls the largest truck he's ever seen. Then they haul it away. At this point, Mel has not gone back to the Nevada hole again. He's sure he's being observed and followed, and doesn't want to take the chance of leading anyone back to the site of the hole. He has been talking to the Basques, though, who tell him that they've seen the seal creature again, and that it's been able to communicate with them by way of their portable radio, using a language they didn't recognize but were somehow able to understand. It tells them that the ice substance is extremely dangerous, and that it should not be used by anyone, that the greedy and undisciplined use of the ice would absolutely lead to the destruction of our entire world. Art Bell at this point prods Mel for evidence again, reminding him about his promise to take photos of the impossible dime he claims to still have in his possession. He also asks if the Basques have made any recordings of the seal creature speaking through the radio. Mel tells him that he's tried on several occasions to take photos of the dime, but each time he does, it doesn't appear in the image. It's as if it refuses to be captured on film. And though everything else in the scene is perfectly visible, the dime itself is not. He goes on to say that even moving more than 15 feet away from the dime will cause it to vanish from sight entirely, only to reappear when it's approached once again. Regarding the communication with the seal creature, Mel tells Art that the Basques did attempt to record the audio, but when they listened to it back, they heard only noises and sounds reminiscent of a shortwave radio. They had no explanation for this, any more than Mel Waters had for the dime he could not photograph. Mel promises to go back and speak to the Basques, where he will gather evidence of these claims and return. But that's the end of the story. He's never heard from again. Well, the story of Mel's Hole is certainly an interesting one. It covers so much ground, both literally and figuratively, that it's difficult to really know where to start. At times, it presents what would be an intriguing mystery, filled with unexplained occurrences and phenomena, clandestine intrigue, and physical anomalies. These are all the makings of a great story. But then it seems to go off the rails, and into some areas that are a bit more difficult to accept. First, let's look at some of the things that were presented that really are interesting and not quite so easy to dismiss. Following Mel's initial appearance on the show, Art Bell says that a television news crew did investigate the area described by Mel Waters. Although they weren't able to locate the hole, they did find evidence of military personnel and heavy equipment in that area, which seems odd. Then there's the satellite blackout of the area Mel described. The Terra server image of that land west of Ellensburg does show a large rectangle of land that's covered with a white square. It's not clear why this would be the case, though we should note that more recent images by Google Earth don't show any such redaction in the same area. Now, it's likely that anything the government wanted to keep secret would have been concealed long ago, long before Google Earth really took off. Anyone that really wanted to effectively hide such a hole has had decades to do so I don't think this takes away from the story. Some people have suggested that it would have been easy for Mel Waters to simply find an area that was already blacked out in the images and then claim his property was within that area. I have to agree that this would have been a clever move to add some third-party credibility to his tale. But one problem with this argument, however, is the timing. Remember, Mel Waters first called into Art Bell's show in February of '97, but Terra server didn't actually launch to the public until June 24th of '98, more than a year later. Okay, so let's look at some of the items that don't quite stand up to scrutiny, and there are several. First, no person named Mel Waters is registered as owning any property in the Ellensburg or Monastash Ridge area around that time. Now, he could have been using an alias, so this is admittedly not a strong argument. Honestly, if it were me, I probably would have used a false name if I had been in his position. It's only common sense, especially if you're worried that the wrong sort of people might be listening and making note of you and what you have to say. Mel told Art that the Yakima firing range restricted airspace was extended to cover his property. While it is true that the Yakima firing range airspace was reconfigured, this happened in April of '96, a year before Mel Waters called into Art Bell's show. What's more, the restricted airspace wasn't extended to cover more area, as Mel had reported. Actually, it was the opposite. The Army was decreasing the restricted areas and releasing them back to public use. And then there's the matter of evidence. Any real evidence to validate Mel's story. There just is none. Art Bell asked Mel Waters on numerous occasions if he could produce photo or video evidence, but it seemed like Mel always had a reason he couldn't. At one point, he says he didn't think about capturing evidence of these incredible occurrences, something that I find difficult to believe. Later, when he's pressed further, he claims that cameras don't work on them, or that the audio recordings of the seal creature, when played back, only sound like radio interference. When Art asks him to take a picture of the dime that has no business existing, which Mel says is in his possession at that very moment, Mel later tells him that the dime doesn't show up in pictures. Finally, when it seems like he won't be able to continue much further without some sort of real evidence, he vanishes, and that's the end of the story. Art Bell can't reach Mel Waters after that, and Mel doesn't respond to his phone calls or emails. He's just gone. The story of Mel's Hole is an entertaining one that's been listened to and discussed by countless people over the last 25-plus years. It's been investigated and turned over exhaustively, and many people have tried to find the location of the holes without any success. Personally, I have a hard time believing the story, and I don't think Art Bell really believed it either. I've listened to the hours of recordings of all of Mel's original appearances on Coast to Coast, and I think Art looked at Mel Waters and this mysterious hole as an opportunity to give his listeners exactly the sort of story he knew they would love. And love it they did. Even all these years later, it's probably one of the most popular topics to come from his radio show, which is saying something. But popularity does not equate to believability. What starts out as an excursion into the mysterious world eventually stretches the limits of what people are willing to buy into. Think about it. We start out with a fascinating story about an unexplained phenomena located in the rural areas of the Pacific Northwest, a place known for odd occurrences and unsolved mysteries. But then, the story takes a turn, and we're presented with more and more fantastic elements, each one more difficult to believe than the last. After the initial broadcast of Mel's first appearance on the show, he tells us about a mysterious government involvement. Later, he goes radio silent for more than 2 years, and resurfaces with a tale of conspiracy, cover-ups, and payoffs. What comes next is something we would expect more from a Hollywood spy movie than real life, with Mel's abduction by the government, his missing 12 days, and then his awakening in a back alley with missing teeth and signs that he'd been drugged and kept on IVs. Look, I'm not saying this couldn't happen. I don't think any of us are naive enough to believe that shady things are not done by big governments all the time, and ours is no different. It's just that we're starting to wade into waters now that are getting a little deeper. If he had left it there, though, I still would have thought it a compelling and almost believable story. But then, Mel takes us on a ride with him as we learn about magical ice that doesn't melt and a mystical seal creature that communicates via radio. This just doesn't feel authentic to me, and I don't mean that it doesn't feel real. I mean that it feels like Mel Waters is not being honest about his experiences. If I had to guess, I think that the story of Mel's hole is something that may have even started out with a grain of truth, but which Mel felt compelled to add to with each new appearance on Art Bell's show. It feels more like a simple hoax that got out of hand and out of his control. When Mel Waters finally realizes that he can't keep it going any longer, he just vanishes. But that's just my opinion. There are a lot of people who believe this story. Who's to say what's real here? In my view, there's really only one man that could set the record straight, and he's not talking. So what do you believe? What do you think about Mel's hole and about the rest of his story? Let me know in the comments below. I'm interested to hear your opinions on this. Thanks for spending time with me today. My name is Brian, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and comment below. It really helps out the channel. And if you have any stories that you'd like to see covered here, please let us know. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.